We have been, as a church, we've been going through the book of Job, and we've been talking about the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And this is another one of those things where there is reflection to be had. This is the season of Lent on the church calendar. Lent is usually a time where you go without, and you reflect about your relationship with God. And so we have been using the book of Job to do that. And we're kind of about in the middle, and we're going to cover a big portion today, but it'll go by quick. I want to tell you, though, there is a Hebrew legend. It's a Hebrew legend. It's a Jewish bedtime story about how Abraham, their patriarch, came to believe in God. As the story goes, Abraham was walking through his land. He was attracted to a glowing light. And as he came upon it, he saw that it was a beautiful palace, and it was lit up by fire. And as he looked on it, he wondered, who is in charge of this palace? And out of the darkness, God says, I am the master of this palace. Now, the Hebrews then offer two explanations for the story as it relates to the human condition and to suffering. Both explanations contain different reactions and different ways to interpret the phrase, lit up by fire. What does that mean? Well, it could mean, one, life is like a palace in the desert. It couldn't have just sprung up out of nowhere. A palace suggests design, planning, plus if there's a light on in the house, that means someone is there, someone lives there. Abraham asks the big question, who is in charge of the world? And God says, I am its master. That's one interpretation. The second interpretation is that the palace is physically on fire, that it's burning. And then Abraham sees this beautiful palace, it's ablaze, and he's worried now that nobody cares. God steps in and he says, have no fear. Bad things may happen in this world. Good things and good people don't last forever, but never suppose that they have been abandoned to chaos. I am in charge of this palace. And so the interpretation is, yes, the beautiful palace is on fire, but just because it's burning, it doesn't mean it's been forgotten. Abraham sees it and says, who's in charge? And God says, I am. Now, of course, this is a story. It's not in the Bible. Like I said, it's a fairy tale, but the story of Abraham and the burning palace, it's a good parable for our time together. This Lent, we're going through the story of Job, and you could certainly say that his life is like a palace on fire, right? Job's life is literally burned and in ash. And the question is raised, does anybody care? Is anyone watching this? Is anyone in charge of this? Is anyone responsible for this? In this Lenten season, we're asking that question. Why do bad things happen to good people? These past weeks, we've looked at Job's friends. Surely his best friends would be able to offer him some comfort in these dark times, right? 3 of them have had a chance to speak and offer their counsel, and look at what Job says back to them for their effort in Job 16. He says this to his friends. He says, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall windy words have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do, if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. Job says, if the roles were reversed, I would do what you were doing. I would talk a lot. I would shake my head. Job says, God gives me up to the ungodly and casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surrounded me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. I have sewn sackcloth upon my skin and have laid my strength in the dust, and my face is now red with weeping, and my eyelids are in deep darkness. You can just hear the brokenness in this man, right? The pain, the torture. Job has lost everything. He's lost his possessions. He's lost his children, all in a blink of an eye. And Job's lament is visceral. It's primal, it's open, it's raw. And even though Job is perhaps the oldest book in the Bible, his message is not old, is it? In fact, I want to read to you a modern lament. Tell me if this sounds any different. How is faith to endure? O God, when you allow all this scraping and tearing on us, you have allowed rivers of blood to flow, mountains of suffering to pile up, sobs to become humanity's songs, all without lifting a finger that we could see. You have allowed bonds of love beyond number to be painfully snapped, and if you have not abandoned us, then explain yourself. A man named Nicholas Wolsteroff, he wrote that. He put that in his book, Lament for a Son. Nicholas was a Yale professor, and in his time, in the blink of an eye, when his son was 25 years old, his son died in a mountain climbing accident. So he was a father one day, and the next day, not. And his lament in this book is a lament about the death of his son. He says, "Will my eyes adjust to this darkness? Will I find you in the dark? Not in the streaks of light which remain, but in the darkness. Has anyone ever found you there? Did they love what they saw? Did they see love? And are there songs for singing when the light has gone dim? Or in the dark, is it best to wait in silence? Noon has darkened, and as fast as they could say, 'He's dead,' the light dimmed. And where are you in the darkness? I learned to spy you in the light, but here in the darkness I cannot find you. And if I have ever looked for you or looked but never found, I would not feel this pain of your absence. Or is it not the absence in which I dwell, but your elusive, troubling presence? It's the neverness that is so painful. Never again to be here with us, never to sit with us at the table. All the rest of our lives, we must live without him. Only our death can stop the pain of his death." Surely, this is every parent's greatest fear, right? To lose your child during your own lifetime. And when we're talking about this question of why, right? Why does this happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? Nicholas Wolsteroff had to ask that same question. Why did this happen? But what he found is, at least for him, the answer to why was not the most important thing. And I think we learned that last week because it's actually a flawed question. You see, for Nicholas, the most important thing was not the answer to why did this happen. No, the most important thing was knowing that God was there during it, with us. God is there with us in our grief. This is what Nicholas writes. He says, instead of hearing an answer, right? That's what we all want. We want the answer. Why is this happening? Instead of hearing an answer, we catch sight of God himself scraped and torn. Through our tears, we see the tears of God. You see, bad times will come, and they will rock your belief system. And it's a system that we all have. It's a system we all believe. We think God is all-powerful, God is completely good, and yet there is evil. Evil exists. And you see, I think when this happens, when bad things happen to us, our first thought is, okay, well, if God is all-powerful and God is good, then he should remove evil. He should abolish this bad thing in my life. When I experience evil, when I experience suffering, God should just wave his magic wand and make it all go away, right? But rather, what we see is not a God who removes our bad times, but rather a God who sits with us during them. And you see, I think that's the key. When we experience hardship, we think our greatest need is to have this go away or to have some sort of explanation as to why it's happening. But that is not our greatest need. Our greatest need is living proof that God has not abandoned us. Our greatest need is Emmanuel, God with us. One of my favorite theologians was a German pastor. He was killed in World War II. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was arrested as a spy. He was accused of being an assassin who had attempted to kill Adolf Hitler. His team failed. He was, of course, thrown into a concentration camp. And this is an excerpt from one of his prison letters. He writes, "God allows himself to be edged out of the world and onto the cross. God is weak and powerless in the world, And that is exactly the way, the only way in which God can be with us and help us. He quotes Matthew 8:17. Jesus took up our infirmities and bore the burdens of our sin. Dietrich writes, this makes it crystal clear that it is not by his omnipotence that Christ helps us, but by his weakness and suffering. This is the decisive difference between Christianity and all other religions. Man's religiosity makes him look in his distress to the power of God in the world. But the Bible, however, directs us to the powerlessness and suffering of God, and only a suffering God can help. To this extent, we may say that the process we have described by which the world came of age was an abandonment of the false conception of God and the clearing of the decks for the God of the Bible, who conquers power and space in the world by his weakness. So there's just a few things I want you to remember when we're talking about Job and when we're talking about suffering and this idea that God sits with us. And that is this, that God first is on the side of the suffering. He is on your side. When you go through these times, I want you to remember that Isaiah 53, it says of Jesus, Jesus was despised and rejected by men. He was a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and yet we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrow. See, God entered the story of human history as one of its characters. From the very first moment, it was never God's role to wipe out suffering, but rather what we see is Jesus gets into it with us, and he walks beside us. And if God remained in heaven, right, and he just wiped away pain with a wave of his hand, that would be impersonal. That would be uncaring. That would just be a distant display of power. But Jesus is person to person. Jesus is the God who touches our skin. One of my favorite passages in the Old Testament, 2 Chronicles 16, says this, the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Psalm 34 says, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. Does it answer the question of why is this happening to me? No, it doesn't. But it does show us that God is not some distant and remote being on a cloud either. Yes, the palace is burning, but God is there, and he is still the master of it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer pointed out that no other religion has this model of God who closely identifies with his creation. God is the God who suffers with us. So whatever grief you feel, God, as our Father, he feels it with you. The second is this, God is in the business of redemption. He is in the business of redemption. Colossians 1 says of Jesus, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things. You know what the Greek word for all things means? It means all things. You know, despite what some pastors and teachers will tell you, there is no guarantee in Scripture that suffering will be removed, only that it will be redeemed. And perhaps if you wanted to use a more current 2014 word, maybe today we would say recycled. You know, if you have your empty soda cans and they're squished, you take them to a redemption center in hopes that those broken and empty vessels will be given a new purpose. You take your dated and broken electronic Apple IIe computer to a technician who can remove the gold and remove the rare earth elements so that he can redeem them. This is how it is with suffering. Dallas Willard once said, nothing irredeemable has happened to us or can happen to us on our way to our destiny in God's full world. When I was a kid, maybe this might be true for you too, one of my favorite shows on TV was Family Ties. I used to watch Michael J. Fox. He used to play Alex Keaton. And to me, Alex Keaton was the coolest guy on television. He wasn't a jock. He was this nerd kid who wore a suit and tie everywhere. And he was just really smart. He was a really savvy character. In 1991, Michael was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and he wrote a book called Lucky Man. In the book, Michael talks about how he used to be before Parkinson's. Before he says he was an ambitious person, he was a driven person, he was somebody who was more concerned with fame, more concerned with fortune. But since his diagnosis, Michael said that they've been the best 10 years of his life. And he says that not in spite of his illness, but because of it. And Michael writes in his book, he says, if you were to rush into this room right now and announce that you had struck a deal with God, in which the 10 years since my diagnosis could be magically taken away and traded in for 10 more years as the person I was before, I would, without a moment's hesitation, tell you to take a hike. I would never want to go back to that life. A sheltered, narrow existence fueled by fear and made livable by insulation, isolation, and self-indulgence. I was a life lived in a bubble. But bubbles, being the most fragile of constructions, are easily destroyed because all it takes is a finger. Suffering isn't always removed, but it can be redeemed, and God is in the redemption business. We never see Jesus walk up to an inflicted person and try to explain away their suffering. He never says, well, you know why you're lame, right? It's because of this, this, and this. We never see him say that. He never says, well, you're blind because you don't pray enough. That's why this is happening to you. In Romans chapter 5, it says, we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope. In the book, A Grace Disguised, there's author Jerry Sittster, and in his book, he recounts the story of him being in a car accident in Idaho. A drunk driver missed a turn, jumped lanes, goes over the median, and it hits his minivan head on. And in the next few minutes, Jerry watches his mother, his wife, and his 4-year-old daughter die. 3 generations of women in a single car accident. But Jerry's book is not about pain or loss or even about asking why. Rather, his book is about living in a world where God is constantly redeeming it. And in his book, he says this. He says, eventually, we all live happily ever after, but only when the redemptive story ends. Which seems like a long way off. In the meantime, you and I are somewhere in the middle of the story, as if stuck in the chaos and messiness of a half-finished home improvement project. We might have 1 chapter left in our story. We might have 50. We could experience more of the same for years to come, or we could be on the verge of a change so dramatic that if we knew about it, we would faint with fear or wonder, or perhaps both. We could be entering the happiest phase of our life or the saddest. We simply don't know and can't know. In my mind, there's only one good option. We must choose to stay in the redemptive story. However unclear it might be to us, we can trust that God is writing it. The book of Job might be the oldest story in the Bible, but its story is certainly not old, is it? 3, when we go through these, we must realize that God is always bigger than anything we will ever face. There was a study once about what was the most contributing factor to spiritual growth. They said, okay, you're so far along in your walk right now. What do you think was the most biggest thing that contributed to that? And I bet you won't be surprised to hear what the number 1 answer was. It was suffering. Job 28 says, but where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, it's not in me. The sea says, it's not in me. It cannot be bought with the finest gold, nor can its price be weighed out in silver. It seems God uses the harshness that we go through to shape us. Joel C. Origari wrote, there's something suspect about a faith that has never been tested. An army going through basic training is not ready for battle. Not until soldiers have faced battle and been under fire do they consider themselves proven and hardened and worthy. A ship cannot prove that it has been sturdily built as long as it stays in dry dock. Its hull must get wet. It must face a storm to demonstrate genuine seaworthiness. God might not always bring a harsh circumstance into our life, but no matter what, we can trust that God will always be bigger. Jesus said in John 16, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." God's bigger. And everyone's favorite verse, Romans 8, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. See, it doesn't matter what happens in your life, things that are good, things that aren't, God will always be bigger than anything you face. There was a Scottish woman who had throat cancer. She was named Margaret. So in her hospital bed, she couldn't speak to any of her visitors. And they would always come in, and they would dote on her, and they would weep and cry, and she couldn't tell them what she was feeling. So she wrote a little note. She put it on her bed so that anybody who came to see her could see what it said. And this is what she wrote. "This is not the worst thing to ever happen. Cancer is so limited. It cannot cripple love, shatter hope, corrode faith, eat away peace, destroy confidence, kill friendship, shut out memories, silence courage, quench the spirit, or lessen the power of Jesus." Martin Luther said, "Affliction is the best book in my library." And you know, I think when we experience suffering, when we're in the thick of it, we're so focused on the trial or how it will end or how we think it'll turn out, but I think God is so much more concerned with how we turn out. Yes, your hull is going to get wet from time to time, but God is bigger than any storm. There's an old wise saying, God is like a mirror. The mirror never changes, but everyone who looks into it sees something different. Some people, they read the book of Job, and it only confirms what they already believe. In effect, they see their own face looking back at them. Job believed in a God who rewards us for being good people. And when Job makes his case, he lists out all the reasons that God should remove this tragedy from his life. He says, "I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. The one who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame. I was father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger, and I thought, I will die in my own house, and my days will be as numerous as grains of sand." But others approach the story of Job with an open mind, and they see something new. Something that leads us to a new understanding, an understanding not of a God who removes suffering, but of a God who gets on his hands and knees and sits with us during it. In the ashes, a God who throws his arm around us, a God who sees our pain and who weeps with us, a God who holds our hand and offers us a tissue box. I think when you find yourself asking why, or when you find yourself like Job and you're arguing for your defense, consider what you'd rather have. A God who explains his actions, or a God who gives us what we most greatly need? Himself. You know, the Bible is a story about a God who gives himself to his people from the very beginning to the very end. That's why it's called the gospel. It's good news. And the good news is that God sent his son. God gave us his most precious gift, himself. It's a tough thing to learn and to know, because I think it's one thing for me to say it, but then when it happens to us, we change and we want to know why. Why is this happening, right? And we just pray, God, take this away. Remove this from me. I don't want to go through this anymore. And at times we feel like, well, God's not listening. This problem's too great. I can't bear this. I wish I could remember then what I know already now, is that God wants to walk through that with me, that God endured watching his own son die. Certainly nothing that's ever happened to me was as bad as that. And to know that I have a loving Father who is willing to go through anything with me, and who promises that he is bigger than anything I will ever face, that should give me the confidence and hope and the faith that I need every single day of my life. And I pray that's what we go through together here as a church. When we come together here, when we break the Word open, that we are learning about a God who walks through everything with us. And the people who sit on our left, the people who sit on our right, our family, our church family, I can't imagine going through life without the church, without the friends and family. And, I was reminded this week, I did a funeral Saturday for a gentleman and talked about Jesus calming the storm on the boats. And I read something in that I don't always remember, and that's that there were other boats out there. It wasn't just Jesus on his boat. So that when the storm rocked their boat, it rocked the other boats too. And when Jesus calmed the storm, he saved the other boats as well. And even though Jesus wasn't on their boat, they knew nothing about it. And I think about, when I walk through suffering and I go through those times, it's not just for me. It's for the people watching. It's for the church too. When they see Christ on my boat and my life is saved, they see the result of Christ in my life, and Jesus is able to save other boats through me. And I just think that's a really pretty picture. And there's no assurance that just because that Jesus is with us and he's on our boat, that our life won't experience storms. And I was thinking, it's so great to have Jesus in my boat when I face those storms. And yet, I can't imagine facing those storms without him. Right? Let's pray.